Today's lecture is the conservative response to the counterculture movement I spoke of in my last lecture. The counterculture movement, you may remember, had formed in opposition to some things they were concerned about in mainstream America, whether it was too much conformity or the Vietnam War or the influence of corporations or the influence of racism upon American society and government and culture. The counterculture movement had formed in opposition to that. The conservative response will form in opposition to some of the more what they would consider to be upsetting aspects or controversial aspects of the counterculture movement. Now, the primary resource for this lecture, again, is your digital text, sections 15.5 and 17.1 and 17.2. 15.5 deals with the Equal Rights Amendment and those that were opposed to it. 17.1 and 17.2 deals with the Nixon presidency, which will be most of the focus of this lecture, including the Watergate scandal. Now, once again, this lecture will be longer than I would like it to be, but I've only got 2 days in which I can instruct you, and there are a lot of things that I find myself bringing up in these lectures as I continue to add to them. You may remember that part of the counterculture movement was the New Left. The New Left was the political wing of the movement. It was led by groups like Students for a Democratic Society and the Free Speech Movement, and what they were seeking was a more participatory democracy, a democracy in which the American people, at least from their perspective, had more of a say in what was going on. And they felt that the government wasn't listening to the American people, and the best example of that was the Vietnam War, which is why the counterculture movement became synonymous with the anti-war movement. Not to be outdone, the conservative response will form what they call a new right movement. And the new right emerges in response to the Equal Rights Amendment. And what they do is they focus upon the more controversial aspects of that amendment, and therefore the more controversial aspects of the counterculture movement. As you can see here, an issue that remains controversial in American society, once again, passionate arguments on either side, is the issue of abortion. People who are pro-life, who are typically conservative, believe that life begins at conception and therefore abortion should never occur. People who are pro-choice believe women should have complete control over their bodies, even when they are pregnant, and that the importance of that choice allows them to determine and to plan their pregnancies when they are ready to become a parent, and therefore allows them to have other options in their lives, such as having careers and not be subject to the control of men, for example. Those are the arguments they make. And so the arguments on either side can be quite powerful, and that is a controversial issue now, or at least a heated one. And you can imagine in the early 70s, late 60s, it was even more controversial as Roe v. Wade will pass in 1973. So those who are against the Equal Rights Amendment are concerned about that. They are anti-abortion, and that is a controversial issue that they focus upon. They also focused upon some other controversial issues that might come about with the Equal Rights Amendment, such as women in combat. Now, in the modern military, the military of 2020, women participate in combat quite frequently, and they often do quite well in combat. But in the late 60s, early 70s, that was not the case. Men were the only ones who experienced combat. And so this would be a controversial issue at the time. Will women be subject to the draft if the ERA passes? If they are subject to the draft, then will they have to go fight? So that was seen as controversial. So anti-ERA people will attack that. And then the other aspect of the Equal Rights Amendment that opponents of it will attack is the issue of LGBT rights, gay rights movement, same-sex marriage, things like that. For some people, even now, those issues are controversial, hard to believe, but for some people, even now, those issues are controversial. America is much more accepting of that issue now than they were in the early 70s, that's for sure. And so in the early 70s, Gay rights was a very controversial issue, and the Equal Rights Amendment was seen as supporting that cause as well. And so those who opposed the amendment also attacked the issue of same-sex marriage. And, the leader of this movement was, ironically enough, a woman. And Phyllis Schlafly was a lifelong conservative. She had ran for political office as a Republican, and she will oppose the Equal Rights Amendment because she believes in traditional American values, whatever those may be, and she believes that the Equal Rights Amendment is in opposition to those values. Now, as you watch the video on the Equal Rights Amendment, you have an assignment on that. There's 2 clips you're supposed to watch. One of the questions deals with feminists viewing Phyllis Schlafly as a hypocrite because she's arguing against the Equal Rights Amendment, she's arguing against feminism, and yet she's benefiting from feminism. She was the leader of a political movement. She was hardly ever at home. She had people who took care of her kids for her. She had a supportive husband. So she had clearly benefited from the Equal Rights Movement, the feminist movement, but yet she was railing against it, railing against those who wanted those same opportunities for themselves. And she tended to exaggerate arguments in the feminist movement, like, they all hate men, they all hate family, they all hate marriage. Perhaps there were some extreme feminists who felt that way, but most women in the feminist movement just supported it because they wanted equality of opportunity. Now, those in opposition to the ERA argued that they were pro-family. Now, that definition of family is the traditional family model, what some would find to be too narrow a family model because you can make the argument that families can find love in various different types of formations. But the traditional family model is the one they support, where the dad is the working head of the household. The mom takes care of the household, and she's the mother, the housewife, and then kids, and, they stay married forever and divorce should never happen. So it's kind of a narrow definition of what a family is, a good definition of what a family is. But there are other good definitions of what families are as well, one could argue. Theirs was one strict type. Now, a legitimate argument that might occur with those who oppose the ERA, who wanted to stop it, was protections with the ERA. There are laws in place that do specifically protect women. Maternity leave laws, for example. And those who are against the ERA argue that it would also do away with those laws as well. Now, ERA defenders say that's not the case, that actually the Equal Rights Amendment would lead to the creation of more laws to protect women in the workplace. But that is something that will have to be worked out if the amendment is ever put in the Constitution. And as of right now, there are 38 states that support it. Virginia, the most recent, has issued their support, and that makes 38 states. So it could come up for a vote on the congressional floor again, but Mitch McConnell, head of the Senate, a Republican head of the Senate, and President Trump do not support that. So I don't know if the ERA will get in the Constitution just yet. A little bit more about conservative responses to the Equal Rights Amendment. They were concerned about a loss of traditional values. Now, people often wonder, heck, I wonder, because there's several different definitions of this. What are typical American values? What are those traditional American values? Well, they would define it as faith, family, patriotism, and hard work, and perhaps some others. And these are all great values. I think sometimes those values can be narrow with the conservative definition, though, and this is what causes discontent among certain groups of people with these definitions. The faith has to be Christian, and conservatives like it when there is Christian influence in the making of laws. They don't always want separation of church and state, at least, and we're talking about people on the far right here. Their family definition, once again, is just that traditional model: mom, dad, kids. Dad is the head of the household. Patriotism is to never question the government, never to question military efforts. And I think protesters have an issue with that because, they don't like the idea of, my country right or wrong. Protesters want their country to be right, at least from their perspective. So there are protesters who argue that it's patriotic to protest if they're trying to make the country more democratic. But for some reason, patriotism and protest aren't always seen as being together. at least not with the traditional conservative model of patriotism. And then work, which is an incredibly good value, hard work, and I would argue that both sides of the political spectrum believe in that. But there's also legitimate criticism here that I think the conservative movement was bringing up, and that there were segments of the counterculture movement that seemed to be rejecting the notion of hard work. For example, hippie culture was, drop out, and kind of leave society behind. They weren't being seen as too productive. So there were segments of the counterculture movement that could be seen as, less than hardworking, maybe even lazy. But you really shouldn't label the entire counterculture movement that way, because those who are organizing protests and trying to increase voting rights and end racism and even end the war in Vietnam, that takes a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of hard work to organize and participate in those protests. So not every segment of the counterculture was rejecting hard work, but conservatives were definitely concerned about those elements that were, and at times labeled them all as doing that. They were concerned about moral decay, lawlessness, crime. Think about some of the things that are happening during this contentious era in United States history. Riots are occurring after MLK is killed. There are hundreds of riots across the country. There was a riot across the Democratic National Convention in 1968. There were protests that had gotten out of control. Think Kent State, okay? And conservatives, Nixon and others, are promising an end to that. They're promising stability. And much of mainstream America is seeking stability. The average everyday American doesn't go to war. The average everyday American doesn't participate in protest. The average everyday American just gets up and goes to work and supports their family. And they would like to see the country settle down. And Republicans, conservatives, Nixon and others are saying that they are the party to do it. They are the party to do it. Now, remember, some of the violence that broke out some of these protests was not always the fault of protesters. Many times it wasn't, as a matter of fact. There were definitely times it was, and there were times the fault was on both sides. But nevertheless, these are unsettling times. And then the other thing that conservatives are concerned about traditionally in American history is the size of the federal government. They don't like it when the federal government gets too involved in the governing of people's lives. They don't like it when it gets too big. They don't like it when it spends too much money. And they were concerned about growth in welfare payments, that perhaps too many people were on welfare, and that, conservatives tend to see welfare as producing incentives to keep people from working. If you're just giving people money because they're poor, then they have no incentive to go to work. Studies don't always support that, but there are definitely some cases where that, there are people who do take advantage of it. So they do have somewhat of a criticism here, even if they do somewhat exaggerate that criticism at times. Okay, Nixon. So moving on to President Nixon, which will encompass the rest of this lecture. And I am going to apologize for the length of this lecture, but I'm trying to cover a lot. So this new right movement will drum up a lot of conservative grassroots base level support, and that'll lead to the election of Richard Nixon, who will be elected president in 1968 and 1972, and later as a factor in the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. So Nixon wins election in 1968 in a very close election, and I'll give you some detail to that in a little bit. 72, he's going to win by a very large margin, and that's despite Watergate rumors encircling him. So we'll get to that in a little bit as well. He's going to be president for about 5.5 years, if you look at these dates here, right? Do I have my math right there? I think I do. January 20th through August 9th, 1974. He's going to be the first president to resign the presidency, and he will resign, of course, due to the Watergate scandal. Which is why Watergate is considered to be one of the worst, if not the worst, scandals in presidential history, because it actually led to a president resigning and leaving office. The other scandals have not. And there is a tragedy of the Nixon presidency, and let me try to explain that. He accomplishes some good things. Historians, when they evaluate presidents, they obviously look at accomplishments, but they also look at the ability to bring people together. And what Nixon will be able to do, with Congress, of course, leaders in Congress, is work with the other side, to work with Democrats in Congress, And they will do things like create the Environmental Protection Agency, which is something that Nixon supported. And I think sometimes Americans forget this, that at one time there was bipartisan support for preserving our environment and our planet, which we only have one to live on currently. It's only in recent times that this has become such a divisive issue, particularly under the Trump administration, as he seems to be cutting environmental regulations on a daily basis. And the thing is, environmental regulations can make it more difficult for businesses to profit, but they can also make, the environment more healthy and therefore people more healthy with these regulations. So at one time, the environment had bipartisan support. And Nixon will also reach across the aisle to support Social Security. He'll raise funding for Social Security. And so that'll be a domestic achievement. And there will be other times that they work together. Those are two prominent examples. And then he'll have a great foreign policy achievement when he opens up trade with and recognition of China. When the communists had won the Chinese Civil War following World War II, the United States, you may remember, refused to recognize Communist China or even deal with them. That'll change under Nixon. Nixon will ease tensions with China. He'll go to China, tour the Great Wall of China, and establish a strong trading relationship with China. That remains to this day. And so that'll happen under his presidency. Not everything in that relationship has been positive, of course. Some of those trade things have not been positive at times for either country at times. But for the most part, that's been a pretty solid economic relationship, and that is a great way to prevent war, is to establish a strong economic relationship. There are 3 strikes against Nixon that I'll address 2 of in this lecture that cause him to be labeled as a failure as a president. One is something he does while he's running for president in 1968. He interferes with peace negotiations with North Vietnam. He contacts South Vietnam and says, don't participate in those. And the tragedy in that is those talks were going very well until he did that. And who knows, maybe the war would have ended, 5, 6 years earlier. And how many more lives would have been saved if Nixon had not done that? Now, why does Nixon interfere with those talks secretly? And we know this, we have evidence of it, we have recordings of it. Because if Johnson would have ended the war in 68, his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, would have probably won. That's who Nixon was running against in 68, would probably have won that election. So Nixon, simply to advance his own political career, interfered with peace negotiations and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. And so that's a huge strike. And we know this because President Johnson had a CIA recording of it. The problem is that recording was illegal, so Johnson couldn't release it to the public. So both Johnson and Nixon will legally record people at times, which is strikes on their presidencies. And then the other 2 things that go against Nixon is he will actually go against civil rights as a president. He'll actually slow down improvements in civil rights. And then, of course, Watergate, which I'll get to those in a moment. All right, so a few things about his presidency, and I'm going to focus on the domestic part, and we can deal with foreign policy in a later chapter, time permitting, with the end of the Cold War. But I want to focus on domestic stuff. And what Nixon wanted to do is he came up with a program called New Federalism. And the goal of that program was to distribute a portion of federal power to state and local governments. Nixon felt that the federal government was too involved in state and local affairs and that they should have more say in how to handle things. And one way in which to do that was to carry out a program called revenue sharing, in which state and local governments could spend their federal dollars as they saw fit with certain limitations. Now, there is a positive and a negative to this. A strong positive for it is you can make an argument that state and local governments have a better idea what problems they need to solve and how to solve them because they're dealing with those problems right on the ground level. Just give us some money, federal government, and we'll take care of these problems ourselves. There's a strong argument for that. They're directly facing those programs. Why should Washington, D.C. be telling them what to do? Very strong argument. There is a strong argument against it, however. What federal government tends to do is mandate what states should do with federal money. A mandate is a strict instruction. So, in other words, we're going to give you this money, Ohio, but you have to spend it on the building of schools. Or we're going to give you this money, Ohio, you have to spend it on environmental regulation. Okay, well, you have to put certain types of filters on smokestacks, right? You have to spend it on this. that can, restrict what states can do, and they can maybe better use that money at times. The reason why the federal government will mandate things is to make sure states use that money for its intended purpose, particularly states with a history of racism, which you could argue that every state in America has, but particularly southern states. For example, if the federal government passes an education bill, funding for education, what states with a history of racism will do is make sure that most of that money goes to predominantly white schools. And the federal government, at least if it's a civil rights president, will say you can't do that. You got to distribute this equally. Make sure your poor districts are getting as well. As a matter of fact, they may say your poor districts should get more of this money because they need it more, and a lot of states don't like that. So there are good reasons for federal mandates too, to make sure the money is going to where it's intended. So there's strong arguments either side on that one. But nevertheless, Nixon will put that into effect, at least to some degree. He will try to reform welfare, but he'll be unsuccessful at it. What he does is he creates a guaranteed payment of $1,600 a year for families of four. And remember, $1,600 goes a lot farther than it does now. But also with work incentives, like you have to be seeking job training or seeking reasonable work, they call it, when offered. Right? In order to stay on welfare, you have to document that you're trying to seek work. That you're not just, living off government income. And he called this the Family Assistance Plan. This was proposed in 1969, but it doesn't pass. Basically, it doesn't pass the Senate because the payments were considered to be too low, although there were some conservatives who thought they were too high, but many thought they were too low, and that the work requirements are too strict. So it doesn't pass. Now, interestingly enough, in the 90s, a similar program, a welfare reform program, sometimes called Workfare, will pass under Bill Clinton, a Democratic president. So a very similar program will actually pass, in which now, in order to stay on welfare, you have to prove that you are actively seeking work if you are able to do so. There are some stipulations in there for single mothers with children and people with disabilities and things like that. But in order to stay on welfare these days, you have to prove that you're seeking some type of work. And that'll be reform that'll pass under Clinton. It was proposed under Nixon, did not pass under him. He kind of contradicts himself here too. Like he'll try to eliminate some programs, such as the Office of Economic Opportunity. What he'll try to do is he'll call it impounding. He'll try to impound funds for those programs. And the Supreme Court will say, you can't do that, Mr. President. Congress is in charge of funding. So he won't be able to impound these programs. But he's contradicting himself a little bit here because this is Johnson's program to really help people in poverty. And what it's in charge of is work training, job training programs. And so here he's kind of requiring that people do that to stay on welfare, but then he's defunding those programs. So kind of tricky here. Like, are you trying to help these people or not? Anyway, but at the same time, you can't say he was totally unconcerned with the poor, because it is during his presidency that funds for Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid will increase. More people will have health insurance under his presidency, and remember, Medicaid is for the poor. He'll also grant greater access to food stamps. So to say that Nixon was completely heartless concerning the poor, which sometimes people try to say, is inaccurate as well. Now, I mentioned some strikes against him. One, those negotiations in Vietnam that he interfered with and caused more loss of more life, perhaps. But also the fact that he slows down the gains of the civil rights movement is what most historians like myself would consider a strike on your presidency. And what he does is by 72, he wants to attract Southern Democrats who are angry at desegregation. He wants to get them to leave the Democratic Party, which had already been occurring. Really, that had been occurring since Truman passed the first Civil Rights Act in 1957. He wants to increase that. He wants to get those people over to his side. And I'll try and give more explanation of this in a little bit. And so what he does is he tries to reverse civil rights policies and slow desegregation efforts. For example, he will order the Department of Education to slow integration plans in South Carolina and Mississippi, two states with very strong histories of slavery, racism, and segregation. And so he'll order the Department of Education to slow those. Now, the Supreme Court will say, you can't do that, Mr. President, because of Brown 2, which was passed in 1955, which said school districts should be desegregating with all deliberate speed. You can't directly interfere with that. So he'll be unsuccessful at doing that. But what he's doing is he's earning the support of these people by publicly ordering these things and stating these things. And he's going to further earn their support when he opposes the extension of the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act had added 1 million African Americans to the voting polls. Okay? But yet he will oppose the extension of that act, but Congress will still continue to extend that act despite his opposition. But what is he doing? He's getting support of Southern Democrats. He's getting them to switch parties. And he will continue to do that with his support of desegregation efforts, really across the country, but even in the North. What might shock you is this is a picture in Boston. You're often used to seeing these images maybe in, Selma, Alabama, right, or Montgomery, Alabama, okay, or Birmingham, Alabama. I keep picking on Alabama, I guess, but you're kind of used to seeing those things in some southern states. This is in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, what the Supreme Court had done by 1971 is they had attempted to implement integration through busing. This is an extension of Brown 2. This is decided in a case called Swan v. Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education. So in that case, they decide that school districts may bus students to other schools to end the pattern of all black or all white educational institutions. Okay? Now what's happening is that white students in cities such as Boston, seen here, and Detroit are angrily protesting busing. I don't know what this guy is doing with the American flag here, but it sure seems disrespectful to it. Kind of an iconic photograph. And to be fair, this program is well intended, but maybe not, in some respects it doesn't make sense, because what you're doing is you're busing kids from one side of town to the other. So you're taking them from their home community school to a school clear across town. Now, there's a noble purpose to it. They're trying to integrate schools, get black and white kids and other minorities to interact with each other, get to know each other, have less hate towards each other. We know that integration can cause that. People get along better. But it's also, you got to think about the pride that people develop in their home schools. Hopefully the pride some of you kids have in Vermilion High School. Pride I have in Vermilion High School, right? Pride I had in my high school in Western Reserve when I was going there, right? You have a pride in your school and you really don't want to leave it. You imagine being forced to leave it, even if it's for a good cause. That would cause a lot of people to get very angry. Even black families didn't necessarily want to be bused across town, even if it was a better school, because they were connected to their schools as well. What they would have liked to have seen is more funding to improve their schools and make them on an equal par with the white schools across town. So it's a complex act, and you can see why people are upset about it, even though its intentions are noble. Okay, Nixon doesn't support it. He's slowing down the pace of integration, or at least trying to. Okay, so let's see. So this Southern strategy, as it's now called, of Nixon's, right, does work. Here's an electoral map of the 1968 election. This election is very close. Okay. For some reason, the map is blue for Nixon here. Usually Republicans are in red, but this is the map I wanted to use because it was clearest. So Nixon's actually blue on this map. I hope that's not confusing for you. But he's going to win a 56% electoral vote. Okay. So electoral vote is always much larger, but that can actually go the other way quite easily if the popular vote just swings one way or the other. Okay, and the popular vote was incredibly close. So this is Nixon's 31 million to 30 million for the second place finisher, right? That's incredibly close, right? And that's going to be Humphrey. Now, the other thing that made this election so close for Nixon was George Wallace, who ran as a segregation candidate, a proponent of segregation in 1968 for the American Independent Party. And you see the states that he won here, okay? Nixon is trying to win those states and probably Texas as well. He's trying to get Texas from Humphrey by 1972, and he does that by coming out against desegregation efforts. Now let's fast forward to 1972. There you go. Now for this election, Nixon is in red, and he wins almost every state. And this is a landslide election win for him. The popular vote is much larger, 60% to 37%, and you see the electoral results of that up here. So this is a landslide victory for him. And what's upsetting to me as a historian for that is the fact that part of that, not all of it, he protests had settled down some. Kissinger had said that, we're going to negotiate in Vietnam, we're going to end the war, Nixon's Secretary of State. So there are other reasons for this. But it's frustrating that part of it is due to the fact that he's, quite frankly, embracing racism. Those are still discriminatory. Those are still who believe in segregation, that whites and blacks should be separate. And that's frustrating. It's just very frustrating that a president can win through fear and hatred. Unfortunately, that maybe sometimes still happens. That can be part of the strategy to win. And so what we see by 72 is a clear transformation where those who are pro-civil rights have slid over to the Democratic Party, and those who are anti-civil rights measures have slid over to the Republican Party. And if you remember this history a little bit, remember the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. Civil War, emancipation, slaves fighting for the North, ex-slaves. Lincoln came out in support of voting rights for at least some blacks before he died. The radical and moderate Republicans will help put amendments in the Constitution to support citizenship and voting rights for black males. But over time, they get more conservative in that area, more tied to businesses and corporations, and less tied to civil rights. And we see FDR build an extraordinary coalition during World War II, where he's getting the support of white laborers, but also of blacks who support civil rights. But we see that start to change as the Democratic Party becomes more strongly embedded with the civil rights movement under Truman and JFK and LBJ, and Nixon rails against that a little bit, and we see this switch occurred. And for the most part, that switch has stayed in place till today, where the Democratic Party is typically more supportive of civil rights acts than the Republican Party is not. And it doesn't mean that the Republican Party is filled with racists. I'm not saying that. But typically what we see is the Democratic Party more supportive of civil rights acts and the Republican Party not. And that transformation was complete by 1972 under Richard Nixon with his Southern strategy. Okay, so transition here to Watergate. This is a transition slide. Remember, Nixon had promised to end the Vietnam War and divisiveness. That's really not happening. The war is ongoing. It's not going to be even over when he leaves office. And his embrace of the Southern strategy is not ending divisiveness. Now, if you go back to this map, a lot of people voted for him. Most states he wins, so maybe you can make some argument that some division has settled, at least among white voters. But some of that divisiveness is still continuing. And he will do so legally and illegally. And here's what I mean by that. By trying to keep these promises legally and illegally, right? Things like, during Vietnam War, he'll bomb Cambodia and Laos illegally, and then things like Watergate, right? So he'll do some things legally, acts and laws and campaigning and things like that, but he'll do some illegal things as well, where he seems to have some disregard for the Constitution. And he will use the FBI and CIA to illegally bug left-wing individuals in Democratic Party offices at the Watergate office building in Washington, D.C. And this brings us to the Watergate scandal. Okay? Now, listen to what I said earlier. Johnson and Nixon both used the CIA to bug people illegally. And you're going to have to forgive me here, kids, because there are definitely some comparisons that are going to pop into my brain concerning our current president due to the fact that he has recently been impeached. So please forgive me for that, but I think it's necessary in this particular case. There are definitely some striking similarities between these two presidencies. Okay, so the Watergate scandal. The Watergate scandal centered on Nixon's attempt to cover up a burglary of the Democratic National Headquarters. Okay, so that's our definition. All right. What we see here is Watergate, a hotel you can still stay in to this day. Now, it's expensive. It's a luxury hotel, but still exists. You go to Washington, D.C. and stay there and tour the city and all those things. And, it's a convention center. It had offices, and the Democratic National Headquarters was renting office space at Watergate, and Nixon will have people break in to try and discover election secrets. Okay, I want to mention, and your text mentions this briefly, which I thought was great, but I want to mention a book here. Books are powerful things. There was a book written in this time period, which has been revised several times since. So there's been other editions issued. I mean, if you look at these presidents, this is past 1973, right? But by the time of the Nixon presidency, the executive branch had become imperial or supreme. Now, that is the thesis of this book, The Imperial Presidency, written by Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. And the reason why it comes up is the Nixon presidency, perhaps Johnson as well, really seemed to embrace this notion. Very powerful presidents who at times seemed to believe that they were above the law. And that this has continued, which is why we have so many presidential scandals. Nixon as president will disregard or ignore constitutional checks and balances. Now, he's going to surround himself with what are called the president's men. Now, this is a small and fiercely loyal group of advisors who developed a sense that they were above the law, right? And so from left to right here, at least if I labeled this correctly, yeah, I did. H.R. Haldeman will be his chief of staff, so kind of like the chief planner of what's going on a day-to-day basis with the president. John Ehrlichman will be his chief domestic advisor. John Mitchell will be his attorney general, who's responsible for carrying out the functioning of the law enforcement agencies of the presidency. And then John W. Dean, who will be just known as his presidential counsel. Now, all of these men, at least through much of the Nixon administration, are fiercely loyal to him. But John Dean is actually, well, they're all pictured here testifying at the Watergate hearings, okay? Although maybe not John Mitchell here. But John Dean will turn against Nixon. When Nixon has him removed from office, he will testify against Nixon, and his testimony will be key to the Watergate trial. Okay, now a few things about this. So why does Nixon do this when he didn't need to do it? He did not need to do Watergate. Okay, and he would have won the election anyway in '72. Let me just go back to that electoral map and look at the results of it. Well, Nixon seemed to live with a great fear of losing elections. Many people describe him, people who worked with him, historians who evaluate him, describe him as paranoid. And maybe there's some justification of that paranoia. He had lost the closest election in presidential history in 1960 to Kennedy. In 1962, he lost an election for governor in California, and everybody thought his political career was over. But he does make a comeback, of course, in 1968 and win the Republican presidential nomination. But he seemed to have this great fear of losing elections. So he's seeking advantages by any means possible. This guy really wants to be president, and so he's going to find whatever he can do to win, legally or illegally, right? I'm going to unify the country, legally or illegally. So he's seen as running a paranoid presidency. He had enemies lists. He recorded all of his Oval Office communications and sought to wiretap or bug any of his so-called opposition. Now, those Oval Office, White House recordings are going to be very key with Watergate. Now, what happens with Watergate? Okay, so using the sections of your text here for much of this, one of the sections in there is a bungled burglary. So on June 17th, 1972, at 2:30 a.m., members of this committee, the Committee to Re-elect the President, CRP, sometimes known as CREEP, that's right, sometimes called CREEP, break in. They break into the Watergate Democratic National Headquarters. And this group, CREEP is led by John Mitchell, who had been his Attorney General, but resigns in '72 as Attorney General to run Nixon's re-election campaign. Now, he's not participating in the break-in, but he'll be involved in the planning of it. And so what you have is 5 members of CREEP who break into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate complex. And what they want to do is they want to photograph documents, they want to plant wiretaps. Basically, they want to find out Democratic strategy against Nixon in '72. A lot of political cartoons come out in this time period. This is just one of them, showing Nixon, doing perhaps planting some bugs here. Nixon himself, he was not directly involved in the break-in. He will be involved in the cover-up, and seemed to have knowledge of it, and that's what will cost him his presidency. The cover-up. Okay, so the cover-up. Documents will be shredded. Any documents that could be considered incriminating will be shredded in the Chief of Staff's H.R. Haldeman's office. So any documents that are like, this can be any way connect Nixon or people in the administration to the burglary, we're going to shred those things, right? The burglars were paid to remain silent. Nixon asked the CIA to urge the FBI to stop the investigation. CREEP, CRP, Committee to Re-elect the President, will give out $450,000 to the burglars to try and buy their silence after they're indicted in 1972. Now, to be indicted is to have charges formally brought against you. The burglars are caught, they're discovered in the act. I forgot to mention that. And so they're charged, and CREEP is trying to pay them to be silent. Nixon and his administration, Nixon in particular, will deny. They will deny throughout this entire investigative process. He'll deny on national television at times. So he'll appear on national TV on April 30th, 1973, for example, to deny it. And despite rumors of Watergate going on, there's really no damning evidence that comes out in 72. And so he's going to win that election in 1972 by a landslide, as I previously showed you. Okay. However, the press will continue to do its job. Now, what is the job of the press? The job of the press, the reason why there's freedom of the press, is to hold truth to power, so to speak, to keep leaders in check, to prevent them from becoming tyrannical, to prevent them from abusing their powers. And so what you're going to have is two reporters from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And they're going to continue to investigate the Watergate incident. Okay? Bob Woodward, by the way, is going on to write several books on presidencies in recent times. He wrote books on George W. Bush. He wrote books on Obama. He recently wrote a book on Trump. And his books are great because all he does is interview people and tell what they told him. So his books are great historical resources. So he's continued to report on presidents over the years. A very valuable resource. Anyway, these two are going to continue to investigate. And they're going to have an inside source by the name of Mark Felt. Now, Mark Felt is a secret informant codenamed Deep Throat who will give Woodward and Bernstein information and link numerous members of the administration to the burglary. Okay. Now, we don't learn the identification of Mark Felt. We don't learn who Deep Throat is until 2005. At age 91, he finally reveals himself, and he'll pass away 3 years later in 2008. But this will be their secret inside source. He was an informant who was working for the Nixon administration at the time, working for the FBI at the time. Okay? And so these two will continuously cover events and write articles that link numerous members of the administration to the burglary, and much of this is based on the information provided by Mark Felt. The White House, of course, will continue to deny every allegation. Cover-up unravels. Now, the burglars will go on trial in 1973, January 1973. The judge pictured here, John Sirica, is an honorable man who will preside over the trial. He has got a stellar reputation in history, some of it because of how he presided over this trial. So he's going to preside over the trial of the Watergate burglars. He believed the burglars had not acted alone, and his close questioning of the burglars will help uncover the involvement of the Nixon administration. He will also receive a letter from a man by the name of James McCord, who was actually in charge of the Watergate break-in. He is a former CIA operative. He had participated in the burglary. He was in charge of the burglary. And his letter to this judge indicated that he had lied under oath during the trial and that powerful members of the administration had been involved in the break-in. And reports of this letter will appear in newspapers and arouse public interest. And James McCord, perhaps due to guilt, will become a cooperating member of the special counsel a cooperating witness to the special counsel that will continue to investigate this. Also, probably to get his sentence lightened as too. I'm sure there's some type of deal made, right? Okay, moving on. So this will lead to the McCord letter, and the results of the trial will lead to a Senate investigation of Watergate. Now, what happens is several members of the Nixon administration resign. April 30th, 1973, Nixon dismisses, let's see here, Special Counsel John Dean, Chief of Staff Haldeman, Chief Domestic Advisor Ehrlichman, and his current Attorney General Richard Kleindienst. What Nixon is doing is getting rid of people that are not doing a good enough job here, or he's trying to pass blame off to these people and insist that he had nothing to do with it. It was these people were involved. I was not involved. And he announces this on April 30th, 1973 in a national televised address. I mentioned that previously. He hires the third attorney general of his administration to oversee it. Kind of like, this is where I see comparisons with the Trump administration, where he's gone through two attorney generals. Jeff Sessions recused himself from investigations into election interference, and he was pressured to resign. And we've had Bob Barr ever since, who is fiercely loyal to Trump, maybe at the expense of doing his job and enforcing the law. And that's what Nixon is looking for, as he's now on his third attorney general in Elliot Richardson to oversee his own investigation. Problem is, that's not enough for Congress. Congress is like, nice try, Mr. President, but we're going to conduct our own investigation. So the Senate is going to continue to conduct their own investigation. And in May of 1973, the Senate begins calling administration officials to testify. A special committee chaired by Samuel James Ervins of North Carolina will lead this investigation. And what happens is these hearings are on television. Now, we've had hearings recently involving President Trump on television, but you have to remember, in this time period, there were less channels on TV. There were only 3, so these trials were on every channel. Hearings involving President Trump, there's hundreds of channels. A lot of Americans just change the channel and perhaps don't get as informed as they should about this stuff. In 1973, this is all people are watching. And so the president's men are testifying one after another every day across the summer. Hopefully they're playing outside some and not watching TV constantly, but nevertheless, when they are, this is what they're watching. Startling testimony comes from this man, John Dean, who has gone on to write several books, testified recently in recent investigations of President Trump. He testifies that Nixon had been deeply involved in the cover-up. He referred to one meeting in which Nixon directly discussed cover-up strategies with several key advisors. Nixon, of course, continues to deny this testimony. Another startling thing that occurs is on July of 1973, presidential aide Alexander Butterfield informs the special committee that Nixon had recorded nearly all conversations. So the existence of tape recordings is a big deal, right? Could this be the key evidence to prove whether or not Nixon was indeed involved with these things? Okay. This next headline, I guess, might shock you, the Saturday Night Massacre. Let me try to explain what's going on here. A year-long battle for the tapes will ensue. Special prosecutor Archibald Cox took Nixon to court for the tapes in October 1973. Nixon refused, and he's going to fire more people. Might sound familiar to you. Nixon refused and orders his Attorney General to fire Cox, the special prosecutor. His Attorney General, Richardson, resigned. He will refuse to do that. So we're going to move on to yet another Attorney General. The Deputy Attorney General will be fired. He doesn't want to fire the special prosecutor. These men have too much integrity. The Solicitor General, Robert Bork, will finally decide to fire Cox. Cox's replacement, Leon Jaworski, however, will prove equally determined to get the tape. So it doesn't matter who Nixon gets rid of. There are people in this time period who are more concerned about justice, apparently. The House Judiciary Committee is now beginning to look at the possibility of impeachment. So not only is Nixon being investigated by the Senate, but the House, the other body of Congress, is now looking into the possibility of impeachment. They're forming an impeachment committee. On top of all of this, his vice president resigns. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigns because it had turned out that he had accepted bribes from engineering firms while he was governor of Maryland. So he resigns, and he'll be replaced by Gerald Ford. So it's a mess. And this is why it's called the Saturday Night Massacre, because this all happens in one weekend in October 1973. And it appears that Nixon is firing people who are trying to uphold the law and investigate him objectively, and he's looking for people to be loyal to him. And we've seen some of this with the Trump administration as well. Okay, so Nixon releases the tapes. So, March of 1974, 7 presidential aides will be indicted. Once again, indicted. Indicted means to be formally charged. C is silent there. Indicted. To indict means to formally charge. They will be charged with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and perjury, lying under oath. Nixon will release edited transcripts of conversations. So he does release some tapes, but they're edited. And investigators want the unedited tapes released. Nixon says, you can't make me do that because of national security concerns. The Supreme Court says, sorry, you need to release all those tapes. What the Supreme Court decides on July 24th of 1974, notice how long this is taking. These investigations take a long time. That evidence involving possible criminal activity cannot be withheld even by a president. And so he's going to be forced to release all the tapes. Nixon continues to maintain he had done nothing wrong. Okay, all of this, as I mentioned earlier, is going to lead to his resignation. The president is going to resign. July 27th, 1974. The House Judiciary Committee approves 3 articles of impeachment. They charge the president with obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress for refusing to obey a congressional subpoena to release the tapes. Okay, a subpoena is a request, a formal request to appear. A writ, formal writing, had commanded that Nixon, a writ or a subpoena, if I can backtrack for a moment, is a command to appear in court. Nixon is refusing to obey some of these. Once again, we saw that recently with investigations into President Trump, where people just didn't respond to subpoenas, seeing a breakdown in checks and balances. Tapes reveal that Nixon was aware of and had approved the cover-up planned. There are tapes that are released on August 5th, 1974. They contain many gaps. Seem like there are things that have been erased. But they did have a key June 23rd, 1972 conversation, 6 days after the break-in, that indicated Nixon knew about the role of members of his administration in the burglary, and he agreed to the plan to obstruct the FBI investigation. So this is kind of the smoking gun piece of evidence. August 8th, 1974, Nixon resigns. The writing seems to be on the wall. He is going to be impeached and therefore removed from office, and he just decides, heck with it, I'm out of here. And he resigns, he gives a very sad speech, and he leaves. But this is the last image of him as president as he goes into the presidential helicopter waving to supporters, because he did maintain supporters through all of this. Okay, so, long lecture, I know, but I'm detailing things more than I would like to because I don't see you every day. Okay, so effects of Watergate. 25 members of the administration will be convicted and serve prison terms. Nixon, except for losing his presidency, which is harsh, he lost his presidency, he resigned. He'll be pardoned, though. He'll face no punishment. President Gerald Ford will pardon Nixon. And Ford does this because he believes it's time to move on, and a trial of Nixon would have taken years, and he just believes the country should heal and move on. But sometimes that can be frustrating. I mean, Nixon participated in a crime here, and because he's president, it seems like he gets away with it, and 25 members of his administration did not. Watergate, this is an era of increasing cynicism or distrust, skepticism, or doubt by the American people. Vietnam has done this with a credibility gap that occurred with Vietnam, where presidents were saying one thing and something else seemed to be happening. We're winning, and really we were losing. And the Pentagon Papers revealed lies presidents had made concerning Vietnam. Watergate just adds to that. And unfortunately, this has continued, right? So American people, they don't trust media either. And, some of that is not good because there are good media sources out there that people should listen to. And so this is unfortunate because when in a democratic form of government, it's nice when people can trust their government. And Watergate has become the scandal that others are compared to. Often when scandals occur, it can be kind of fun. You can look them up online if you want. But whenever a scandal occurs, even if it's a silly, like one with a pop star or something, people add the word gate to it, right? Many scandals have the word gate taxed to it. I remember when the Iran-Contra scandal was occurring with Reagan in the 80s, it was often called Contragate or something like that, or Iran Gate. And, so it's an example of how scandals are compared to it. Okay. Now I'm going to close with comparing it to our current president because that's been done quite a bit. And I think there's a couple things to look at here. Okay. And this doesn't mean that, Trump has done some good things like Nixon. His trade deals, if they actually go through, might do some very positive things for the global economy. Although with those trade deals, you have to give credit to Congress as well, particularly with the labor conditions that the Democratic House had put into those trade deals. It was definitely a bipartisan achievement, but nevertheless an achievement. The economy stayed good until recently. It did decline every year a little bit under Trump, just a little bit. There's a little bit of retraction, but still stayed very good until, of course, this virus came along. So like any president, he's done some good things, but he's also done some pretty bad things. And what upsets historians like myself is interfering with the integrity of the election system is very important. And Nixon tried to interfere with that, and there seems to be a lot of evidence that Trump did as well. That's why he'll be impeached. The election collusion, the election interference is particularly alarming because the integrity of our elections is very important if we're to remain a democracy. And so there was a lot of evidence brought forward against Trump concerning the 2016 election with Russian interference, and then recently a recording where he's actually soliciting Ukrainian interference in the 2020 election, where he actually promised to withhold aid to Ukraine if they could dig up dirt on Joe Biden for him. That's troubling. And so scandals like this, where election interference is going on, whether it's Watergate or seeking foreign influence in elections, are troubling to those of us who wholeheartedly believe in democracy. And so I think a key question that needs to be asked now is, okay, so if Trump's scandals are as bad as Nixon's, or maybe almost as bad as Nixon's, then why is he still in office and Nixon had to resign? Well, I think there's some things to look at here. Now, remember, Trump will be impeached. Okay, Nixon doesn't get impeached. He resigns before that happens. He probably would have been. He would have been impeached and probably removed. Trump isn't impeached, but he hasn't been removed. So why does that happen? Why did Nixon have to resign, and why is Trump still in office? Well, there are some comparisons here. First of all, Nixon dealt with a Democratic Congress. Trump has a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. So the Democratic House of Representatives impeached him, but the Republican Senate decided that he should not be removed from office. Okay. So both houses were Democratic when Nixon was president, so politics is a factor, right? However, one could argue that the Republican Party perhaps had more character in this time period. And so some of my frustration was in the makeup of the current Republican Party. Because if you look at the Nixon presidency, several Republicans in this time period stated they would no longer support Nixon once that tape came out that was incriminating. Once that key piece of evidence came out, they said, President, you no longer have our support. And these are members of his own party. Barry Goldwater himself will directly tell Nixon. Now, Barry Goldwater was a diehard conservative, ran in 1964, lost to Johnson. He will tell Nixon, hey, we're not going to support you anymore. You have lost the support of the Republican Party. That doesn't happen with Trump. Mitt Romney is the only Republican senator to vote for his removal, and he did so because of what he called strong moral convictions and the weight of evidence. And instead of being celebrated for, you know, standing on what he believed to be morally right, he was vilified by members of his own party and the Republican press, despite the weight of evidence. I think the other factor that you have to look at when you compare these two scandals is, quite frankly, the existence of Fox News. I think it'd be accurate to label Fox News as more of a commentary network, maybe even a propaganda network than a news network, if you just look at research about the accuracy of that network. But Nixon didn't have that. Nixon didn't have a news network that was constantly defending him. The press, really the press's job is to confront American leadership and keep it in line, tell the American people when it's being unethical. And what we see in Fox News is it goes overboard to defend whatever Republican candidate might do. Now, the argument for the need for Fox News, of course, is that, Nixon himself said in this era, and Republicans have said over the years, well, most media outlets are liberal. Maybe not. I think you'd have to look at each individual outlet to determine that. And I think that the thing that happens when you make that argument is you got to look at this press that existed during the Vietnam era didn't just attack Nixon, it attacked Johnson pretty good too. And Johnson was a very liberal president as you look at his civil rights acts. But the press didn't hesitate to go after him as well. So for Nixon to say that the press was just attacking a conservative president, I don't find it to be too accurate in this era. The press was doing its job. And so even if you have the existence of liberal media, what liberal media does is they heavily scrutinize leaders, whoever they may be. Obama got attacked at times by the liberal press for early on in his presidency for his treatment of immigrants until some reforms came about in his presidency concerning those actions. So sometimes I think you can almost make the argument, and I think there's a lot of evidence for this, that Democratic candidates face much tougher press scrutiny because not only is Fox News going to attack them for every little thing and defend Republicans as much as they possibly can, but liberal news outlets, maybe they'll attack Trump more. Trump gives them a lot of reasons for his attacks because he lies on a daily basis. But liberal news outlets, if they truly are liberal, they'll attack Democrats too when they screw up. And so there's really a lot of scrutiny upon Democratic candidates, and we see almost a double standard here in that Trump can say what he wants and does what he wants and seems to get away with it, but for a Democratic candidate, if they say one thing, even politically incorrect, their candidacy is done. So I just don't know if that holds up, that there's this media bias that is just destroying the Trump presidency with the existence of Fox News. And the reason why I bring up Fox News is it's relevant here because Nixon first proposed this type of network when he was president, and Roger Ailes was his media consultant. Now, Roger Ailes wasn't able to create a Fox News while Nixon was in office, but one will come about later that always spins things to defend Republican presidents or candidates. Now, what we want is whether a news outlet has bias or not, whether it's right or left, what we want is accuracy. And my frustration with Fox News is the lack of accuracy. Now, and I should probably shut up because it's a ridiculously long lecture, but unfortunately, I think the Fox News formula has affected other networks because with Fox News and the creation of it, its ratings have been very good. So what CNN has done, for example, MSNBC, and I think particularly under Trump they've done this, is they have gone more left, and their accuracy has declined as well too. And that's frustrating. But what has it done? It's increased their ratings because people who don't like Donald Trump want to watch those networks and have ammunition to argue against him. And but that's frustrating because very little is being done on a bipartisan basis now. And as the successes of the Nixon presidency and the Johnson presidency, and there were successes in those presidencies, and as those presidencies tell us, presidents and government gets things done when the two sides work together. And the division that is going on in this country right now is very unfortunate. And it's something that we need to overcome so that we can continue to accomplish great things. Thank you for your attention. I apologize for the length of this lecture. Please make sure you take the time to comment on it or ask a key question. And you may want to use the Watergate notes for your test essay if you choose to focus on Watergate as a presidential scandal. Okay, thank you very much.